la lengua de la profesora que hemos traído este año para cerrar las actividades de este 2019. A quien la doctora Erika Summers-Effler es investigadora de la Universidad de Notre Dame en Indiana. Es licenciada en Psicología, maestra y doctora en Sociología por la Universidad de Pensilvania, cuyo doctorado obtuvo en el año 2004. Es una profunda estudiosa de Randall Collins, de quien además fue discípula. Su trabajo de investigación se centra en las dinámicas emocionales de estabilidad y cambio social, temática que la vincula con múltiples campos teóricos, desde las emociones y la cultura hasta los movimientos sociales, los grupos sociales minoritarios y la religión, pasando por la microsociología y la ciencia social cognitiva. Su trabajo de investigación la ha llevado a desarrollar novedosas técnicas etnográficas y a llamar la atención sobre la importancia de reconocer, representar y narrar las emociones que emergen en el trabajo de campo etnográfico. Algunas de las revistas en las que figuran los resultados de investigación de la doctora Erika Summers-Effler son Sociological Theory, Theory and Society, Advances in Group Processes, Contemporary Ethnography, Philosophy of Social Science. Su libro, Laughing Saints and Righteous Heroes, fue publicado por la editorial de la Universidad de Chicago en el año 2010. En él arroja luz acerca de los procesos de sincronización de la interacción social con ámbitos más inclusivos como pueden ser grupos sociales, organizaciones sociales e incluso la sociedad misma. En ese libro muestra la manera en que dicha sincronización entre las microinteracciones y las meso- y macrointeracciones incide en la posibilidad de modificar pautas sociales a otros niveles de organización social. Dicho de otro modo, revela cómo las microdinámicas pueden influir en procesos macrosociales a la manera de la microsociología radical de Randall Collins. En el artículo en coautoría con Deborah Qua, publicado en el 2015 en Theory and Society, titulado de manera muy sugestiva, Weber, nuestro sociólogo, ¿no? Me perdonan mi inglés, ¿no? Weber's Missing Mystics, Everyday Mysticism in the Work of Dorothy Day and Mother Teresa. Las autoras argumentan que Weber ignoró cómo el misticismo del mundo interior puede promover el cambio social a través de la redistribución de los recursos materiales y emocionales durante la interacción social. En otro artículo que tuvimos la oportunidad de trabajar en el marco del seminario, Picking in the Black Box, The Implications of Mirror Neurons for Ethnographic Work, publicado en el Journal of Contemporary Ethnography en colaboración con Justin Van Ness en el mismo año 2015, las autoras sostienen, o los autores, que la etnografía puede beneficiarse del desarrollo de las ciencias cognitivas sobre el funcionamiento del cerebro, en particular las llamadas neuronas espejo. Otro trabajo de ella que tuvimos la oportunidad de conocer, Defensive Strategies, the Formation and Social Implications of Pattern Self-Destructive Behavior, fue de mucha importancia en el marco de las discusiones del seminario, porque en él la doctora nos muestra cómo la progresiva mengua de la energía emocional que produce el permanecer en relaciones destructivas que viven mujeres que son sometidas a violencia, termina por degradar sus recursos cognitivos de manera que las hace permanecer aún más en esas situaciones de violencia. Es un impedimento para salir de ellas. Eso fue algo que nos sirvió de mucha utilidad cuando proseguimos conociendo su trabajo a partir de haber estudiado la obra de Randall Collins. En suma, la doctora Summers-Effler ha sido merecedora de importantes distinciones, en particular de las secciones de emociones y de la sección de teoría social de la Sociedad Americana de Sociología, y es sin duda para nosotras, en el marco del seminario, un honor y un privilegio tenerla entre nosotros hoy. Bienvenida, welcome, and we are very grateful to you for accepting coming to Mexico City and have this encounter with us. In spite of the bad, image of Mexico internationally because of violence. So we are very grateful to you, and we are very excited to, as I told you yesterday, to see, our references, acting real in a real way, not reading them only. So putting face to our authors, body and flesh, as I told you yesterday. So thank you very much. We are very honored.
Well, thank you. And thank you for what I believe was probably a very kind introduction. I appreciate that very much. Thank you for inviting me. I am absolutely thrilled to be here, and honored to be able to talk about my work. All right, I'm going to start right away with a question, if I can get this to work. Okay, here we go.
Yes.
How do persistently failing social movement groups persist? Perpetually failing, social movement groups persist. And then I'm going to give you the answer immediately, so I'm giving you the punchline, okay? Such groups sustain involvement by doing indirect emotion work. Okay, it took years of ethnographic observation of two perpetually failing groups to understand the group's complex yet patterned emotion work. Initially, I simply saw failures followed by convoluted emotional dynamics with mood and emotion swings and emotional recovery, right? And I had no idea what was going on for quite a long while. But with time and analysis, I eventually saw dangerous draining emotion, transmutation into manageable draining emotion, and springing back to emotional recovery. So by the end of the talk, I hope that you will be able to see this pattern too.
Closer to you because they are recording.
Oh, okay. So I also like to give the schedule at the beginning of the talk so you know where you are as I'm going along. All right. So here's the schedule for the rest of the talk. So a depiction of elastic emotions in the groups I studied, theoretical development, and then methods, which normally go at the beginning. But as I understand, people are very interested in methods around here, so I thought I would save it for the end. Okay, so the data for this talk are from a comparative ethnography I did quite some time ago. While my theoretical analysis is still emerging, I reuse data because you will see the kind of data that I'm interested in are quite difficult to get. So in short, I'm using old data for new theory. If there are empirical questions or suggestions about how to get the sort of data that you're going to see presented, I would love to talk about that at the end of the talk. So the ethnography was of two altruistic social movement groups. One was a group that was living together in a single house, and they were part of the Catholic worker movement. The other was an anti-death penalty group. Now, the groups were similar in size and level of commitment, but otherwise, I chose the groups for their differences in values, strategies, structures, and of course, most importantly, their emotional tones. In other work, I've referred to the Catholic workers as the radical saint model of altruistic organizing. They focused on authentically living up to their moral vision. The anti-death penalty group, on the other hand, was comprised of passionate liberal reformers. I refer to their style, I refer to their style of organizing as the heroic model. They cultivate righteous anger and power. So even though both altruistic and both social movements, very different emotional tones. I chose to study these perpetually failing social movement groups because they provided a particularly good opportunity for observing processes of emotional failure and recovery. That's what I was primarily interested in. Because these groups perpetually failed, it was possible to identify recovery patterns. And if I had studied less risky groups that were not failing all the time, it might have taken me years longer to detect these patterns. Ultimately, I believe that the theory I develop here will help us to also better understand dynamics that are relevant to high burnout fields like teaching, nursing, and social work. All right, so now I'm going to provide a bit of background on the groups. Okay, the Catholic worker theology is not so different from the better-known liberation theology. The Catholic workers believed that they were morally charged with living together in community and literally living out the corporal works of mercy from Catholic social teaching. For those of you who do not remember or are not familiar with what the works of mercy are, they are feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, welcoming the stranger, clothing the naked, visiting the sick, visiting the prisoner, and burying the dead. They actually don't do much burying the dead, but everything else they do quite a lot of. The Catholic workers advocated for radical change. They believed that they needed to live out the corporal works of mercy, and that if they did this, there would be a transformation in society. And that might seem far-fetched, but they genuinely believed if they lived this way, it would result in what they called creating a new world in the shell of the old. So they saw this process, this radical transformation, was going to end in a society-wide return to subsistence farming. They saw this as a back to the land movement. Now this is where it starts to diverge a little bit from liberation theology and become very specific to the Catholic workers. The Catholic worker house was chaotic and usually overrun with people searching for food and shelter. And it was a good depiction of the Catholic worker house would be if you would walk into the house, you would have no idea who was there for help and who was a Catholic worker. Everything was totally chaos almost all the time. So the Catholic workers' day-to-day emotion work was the cultivation of joy through service. However, occasionally joy was not so easy to find. Sometimes people they served took advantage of them or lied to them. When this happened, they grew not only angry with the guests, they grew angry with each other. I repeatedly saw that when anger took over the group's mood would plummet. The groups recovered from anger by first evoking devastating grief. And then they would talk about things like children looking for food in garbage piles, families being forced to choose between staying together and having shelter. And it would be easy to imagine that piling this sort of grief on top of anger would make things worse for the Catholic workers emotionally, but it did quite the opposite. In actuality, feelings of grief were followed by side-splitting humor, riotous laughter. This was a combination I found very confusing for quite a long time. Now, their funny stories were generally about particularly humorous guests. When the Catholic workers told these funny stories, they portrayed themselves in a way that was the exact opposite from how they tried to live out their day-to-day lives. They depicted themselves as tough, unsympathetic, fed-up characters. Their stories inspired waves of laughter, and they never failed to restore the group emotional tone. So in sum, the Catholic workers restored themselves emotionally by moving from draining anger to devastating grief to liberating laughter. So in the following story, I will highlight these dynamics. So this is a story from the field. So Kenny, one of the workers' guests, disappeared one day. And then they got a call saying that he had been hospitalized for an infection surrounding his heart, which is a sure sign he had been using dirty needles. One day later, the workers found out that Phil, a different guest, had been prostituting his wife for drugs out of the Catholic worker house. Now, in response, anger built. Arguments between community members increased until I thought the group might fall apart. And one night, Joan, who was one of the emotional leaders of the house, this was a community that supposedly everything was consensus. There were no leaders, but there were definitely emotional leaders, and Joan was one of them. She began to grieve openly, not just about the guests, but about tragedies all over the world. She talked about suffering. And she talked about children suffering, and she talked about grandmothers suffering. And she also grieved for her own inadequacy. And she told stories of neighbors near where they lived who humbled her with their generosity. Later that night, the group ate in solemn silence until Linda, another Catholic worker, brought out coffee after dinner. Now, over coffee, Joan gave a slight brief chuckle to herself, and then she raised her eyes to the group. She started to tell an apparently old and familiar story, barely suppressing a smile. She began, "One night when I was alone, I heard a knock at the door. It was past time for sandwiches, but I decided to answer it anyway." Now Linda, who brought out the coffee, started to smile, clearly recognizing the story. "When I opened the door, A little drunk man fell right through. I mean, he fell right through the door and hit his head on those stairs, she said, pointing back to where the stairs were. He just lay there, stretched out like that, with his head on the stairs for a good long while. Now, I started to worry because I couldn't wake him up. I thought, my God, this little drunk man died hitting his head on the stairs. But after shaking him and yelling at him for a few minutes, he started to move. He groaned and tried to say something. I was pretty annoyed with him at this point and told him he was going to have to move at least enough for me to shut the door. Then he lifted his head slowly and in a drunken slur asked, "Can I get a sandwich?" Now, Joan was laughing so hard she could not speak, and Linda, similarly laughing uncontrollably, could barely sit up. Linda tried a couple times before she was able to choke out, "One night, I came home late, and I realized the next day was recycling. I had to get the recycling bins from the shed behind the house in order to organize it. It was dark, and I thought I heard some noises, so I thought I better get a flashlight and check. Joan begged me not to go and check, and Joan added, 'I did. You know how stubborn she is. It's like horror films. You just shouldn't check those scary noises.' Now, Linda said, 'I heard the noises again and was convinced it was a squirrel or a raccoon or something like this, and I opened the door slowly, afraid of being attacked by a rabid animal, when out rolled," and she paused for dramatic effect, "the little drunk guy." She was laughing so hard she could barely speak again. He rolled out, popped right up, and said, "Can I get a sandwich?" And I told him, "No, you cannot have a sandwich, and I'll give you 5 minutes to get the hell out of here." All right, so this is a story about how the Catholic workers worked emotionally. You can see in this story they went from angry despair to collective grieving to healing laughter. And towards the end of the talk, I'll talk a bit about why they were able to use grief to trigger laughter. All right, so on to the next group. The name of the anti-death penalty group was STOP. Compared to the utopian goals of the Catholic worker, STOP was attempting to achieve an easily measured, concrete external goal. They wanted to end the death penalty in the U.S. Now, since people are actively being executed in the United States, this group had a deep sense of urgency. STOP's leadership strategy was focused on expanding the movement in terms of the number of people they had at protests, the media space that the group took up, and the extent of their political influence, so influence in traditional politics. In order to get attention, they split their time and energy between organizing protests and trying to lobby politicians. Now, unlike the Catholic Worker House, STOP's office looked and felt like a traditional office. They had desks, computers, staff meetings, paid staff, and an open hierarchy among the staff members. Now, if anger was dangerous for the Catholic workers, sadness was at least as dangerous for STOP. Quite the opposite of the workers, STOP's safest emotion was anger. Now, STOP members knew inmates who would likely die. Despite STOP's efforts, there was very little they could do to help any particular inmate. And if they allowed themselves to be sad, they could potentially fall into a bottomless well of sadness. When STOP members felt such sadness, they needed to do emotion work to pull themselves out of these emotionally dangerous situations. Horror, in response to those who promoted and used the death penalty, was actually a comparatively manageable emotion. Indeed, STOP members combated sadness with horror stories, and these horror stories were about legal injustices, those who were wrongfully convicted, and the dehumanizing treatment of death row inmates. In the following story, I highlight the emotional dynamics within STOP. All right, so this is another story from my fieldwork. Marge, one of STOP's employees, hung up from her last call and stalked over to the table where I was stuffing envelopes. She was fuming and gesturing wildly as she started telling a story she had just heard from a family member of somebody who was on death row. The guards were scaring this mentally handicapped man on death row. Now, besides the point he shouldn't be there anyway, the guards have no business tormenting him. They scared him, really scared him, and then he went in his pants. Of course he did with them scaring him like that. And then you know what they did? And she didn't wait for me to guess. They beat him. That's right. They beat him for going in his pants after they scared him half to death. I responded, "Oh, how sad." And she looked annoyed, but kept on talking as though she hadn't heard me. What kind of person needs to feel bigger than a man with such a low IQ? What kind of people beat somebody who are already helpless? I'm telling you, these people have got to be stopped. People have to know, they have to get active, and then we're going to stop this whole hateful business. She turned on her heel and stalked back to her desk. Now, the next day, I returned to stuffing envelopes. The office was quiet, and as I worked, I asked Marge, "Was there much support for death row families before stop?" Marge responded, "No, people just bumbled around by themselves. Everybody was all alone, and they felt so ashamed, too. They put most of the death row inmates across the state, and most of these families were either too poor to visit or they had never left the city, so they couldn't conceive of going across the state. Some of the inmates were abandoned by their families, but a lot just couldn't afford to go. This one elderly woman was trying to get information on her son so she could visit him. No one would call her back. She had been trying to figure out how to get to her son for years, but no one would even call her back." And I said, "Oh, that's so sad." Now, Marge furrowed her brows and corrected me. "I like to look on the positive side. It would be sad if we weren't doing this." I could tell she was frustrated with me, but at the time I didn't understand why. Now, Marge sighed, suddenly looked tired and far more older. "You know, these stories, they make me so emotional. How can there be so much injustice, so much that's wrong with the world? These stories overwhelm me at times. They really do. I need a break. I do. I'm just getting tired. I have 2 grandchildren to take care of. Everybody will try to get you down and make you feel bad when you're out there at the protests and people walk by and say, 'I think they should kill more of them.'" She shook her head. "People tell me if I want to help, I can't get so emotional, but it is emotional for me. They know I'm tender-hearted. I try not to get so emotionally overwrought." I didn't know what to say, but she clearly expected me to say something. So brilliantly, I just changed the subject. I said, "So, are the civil affairs police who monitor the protests the same people every time? Do you know any of these police?" Her tone perked up, and she sounded more conversational than exhausted as she responded. "The police aren't always the same, but I recognize a lot of them. I don't really know them, but they're usually friendly." So she was beginning to sound angry again. "You know, one time one of them came up to me on the sly and told me that he didn't believe in the death penalty. He said he'd seen the places some of these criminals come from, and he believed that most of them never even had a chance. Really, I don't know why they let all the disadvantaged and mentally handicapped people grow up. They might as well just kill them as babies." With that comment, she picked herself up and headed back to work. Now, eventually I stopped interpreting everything as sorrowful and came to understand that sadness drained stop members. I also began to recognize that Marge's horror stories were the first part of a 2-step recovery effort. First horror, and then back to the safety of anger. All right, so now I'm going to give you a little bit more theoretical treatment of the dynamics of harnessing the power of negative emotions. When thinking about opposite emotions, I thought of Plutchik's emotion wheel. Some of you may be familiar with this. I hope you can see. Oh yeah, you can see that, I think, fairly well. These are where emotions are arranged on a wheel so that the emotions that are across from each other are opposite. So grief is across from ecstasy, vigilance across from amazement, terror across from rage, and loathing across from adoration. Now, this model was enormously helpful in analyzing the patterns I just described. I'll draw on Plutchik's wheel to talk about the potential power in opposite emotions. But first, I want to explain the concept of emotional vacuums, which is a concept I developed while doing this analysis. An emotional vacuum is a heightened awareness of a lack of a particular motivating emotion, coupled with the building tension associated with an opposite draining emotion. So I'll say this again in a different way to make it a little bit clearer. But the groups use these emotional vacuums in their emotion work. So groups leaned into the draining emotion, heightening the tension of the emotional vacuum. When the emotional vacuum, when they were successfully released, when this tension was released, there's an accompanying flood of the opposite motivating emotion. So if you had terror and built up tension around terror, and you were able to release that emotion and that tension associated with it, you'd have a flood of rage. Now, for some people, rage, obviously for the Catholic workers, would be a demobilizing, a draining emotion. But for STOP, it was an empowering emotion. All right, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about, you can still a little bit see that. The dark blue petal is the mundane emotional drains they leaned into to spring to the opposite emotions in the light blue, right? So for STOP, you have the dark blue of fear and terror, and they would lean into that and then spring over to rage and anger. And for the Catholic workers, you would have sadness and grief, and they were able to build on that tension and spring over to ecstasy is probably a bit strong, but joy, definitely. Or maybe if somebody can't sit up because they're laughing so hard, it's fair to call that ecstasy. So the workers faced the day-to-day routine tasks of the feelings of grief when they were not able to help everyone who needed help. In order to release the emotion of grief, the Catholic workers cut attention off from sadness and applied joy through humor. So STOP members faced day-to-day feelings of apprehension and fear when an execution was pending. And they faced terror when the executions were much closer. Now, in order to release the emotion of apprehension and fear, STOP members cut off fear and evoked righteous indignation or righteous anger. Now, both groups' day-to-day emotional maintenance required them to become experts at shifting between leaning into draining emotions and springing over to motivating emotions. Grief to joy for the workers, fear to anger for STOP. Now, this wheel helped me think about the less direct emotional work these groups engaged in when they experienced what I refer to as dangerous draining emotions. I observed that not all emotions were equally easy for these two groups to release. Any draining emotion these groups could not directly counter threatened the groups with potential collapse. So peak emotions are also a part of this story. So I'm going to highlight the group's peak emotions. There, I'll probably have to read that to you. For the STOP, their peak emotion between interest and serenity was optimism. And for the Catholic workers, between apprehension and distraction, there is awe, all right? And I'm not exactly, the pedal ends up working, you'll see, in terms of explaining what's going on, although I'm not sure why awe ends up between those two. But anyway, so the optimal peak experiences are highlighted in green. Now, neither group could produce these peak emotions on their own. For the Catholic workers to feel a sense of awe, they needed guests to at least be appreciative and even possibly achieve housing or gainful employment because of the workers' efforts. More often than not, guests exchanged the Catholic workers' food boxes for drugs, or guests would steal from the Catholic workers and then disappear. For STOP, their peak emotion was optimism, but likewise, they could not achieve this on their own. It was only very rarely that there was a sense of optimism from legal reform or if there was a chance that a particular execution would be halted. So in sum, the Catholic workers felt like saints when they made themselves vulnerable, and these efforts resulted in helping others to by crossing social boundaries that were very difficult to traverse. And that's when they experienced awe. And STOP members felt like heroes when they took on the opposition, emerged victorious, when they played David to the system's Goliath. All right, so along with their mundane work, they occasionally encountered, as I've talked about before, dangerous emotions. Risk-taking was the only path to these peak experiences, the ones that had been highlighted in green. These risks did not always pay off, and when they didn't, that's when they spiraled into dangerous emotions. So the red petals indicate the most dangerous emotions for the group. Thus, they were forbidden. Thus, the reaction to Marge's reaction to mine, oh, that's so sad, right? This was a dangerous, forbidden emotion. Now, I'll briefly review how this works. Okay, so what would happen is they would start with the red and slide over to the dark blue, which they were used to managing, and use that to spring over to the light blue. All right, so the workers redirected anger and frustration, for which they had no direct release, into grief by telling tragic tales. And the Catholic workers also routinely grieved their own moral failings. For example, the workers often talked about feeling inadequate for not participating in civil disobedience that would have landed them in prison for years. So telling tragic tales and publicly calling attention to personal weaknesses and failures may appear self-destructive to the outsider, but leaning into their grief, it lowered their boundaries, reinforced intimacy between them, generated emotional intensity, and reestablished the members' focus on the group. So rather than depressing the group, grief and humility also created a hunger for solidarity, optimism, and humor. Ultimately, STOP did not have the resources to generate the feelings of optimism on their own. They could not control how, when, and if they would have any political victories. Sadness required these unattainable emotions for release, so the group would generate another draining emotion that they did have the power to release, horror, in order to recover with righteous indignation. Now, members of STOP were well practiced in this process. They knew how to be an audience for a well-performed angry rant, just as I hadn't been when I first started there. The group used anger to keep dangerous emotions at bay and to preserve emotional distance from death row inmates and to inspire their action. So if you put it all together, this is what it looks like. It's important to note that these groups' capacities to transmute dangerous negative emotions into manageable emotions enabled the groups to be somewhat emotionally independent from their immediate social context. This allowed them to be stable during really threatening times. So building on the comparison of these two groups, we can see that if negative emotions can be harnessed, they can be a particularly powerful tool for emotion management. This elastic springing process also energized the groups because the practice itself helped to reestablish a shared focus of attention and emotional intensity. So as described, the emotional transmutation began with storytelling rituals. Now, drawing on Randall Collins, we can look at ritual more directly. Rituals required a shared focus of attention and a shared mood. They generate a sense of solidarity, an increase in emotional energy, and sacred symbols. Through these negative storytelling rituals, emotional leaders generated an increase in what I call potential emotional energy. What I found was that not all emotional energy is free-flowing. In these cases, interaction rituals around negative stories highlighted a heightened sense of tension that built up emotional energy, but held the emotional energy at bay while it was building. So you can imagine it sort of building up. So there's a lack here, and it's building up here. I suggest that the potential emotional energy helps to explain what I've been referring to as emotional vacuums. First, negative stories generated a shared focus, a shared mood, intensity, and emotional energy that began to dam up. Now, once released, there was a euphoric flood of emotional energy. Now, stories that evoked humor and joy for the Catholic workers and righteous indignation for STOP released powerful flows of emotional energy. In general, I would suggest that when actors share risks, they eventually end up sharing this emotional sequence of failure, a vacuum, the flooding of emotion, and a sense of expansion and recovery. Now, in order for this process of the vacuum releasing to work, the groups had to have the capacity to first lean into the negative emotion that built up the tension, and two, be able to tell compelling motivating stories that ran counter to these emotional vacuums. So it must be noted that not all recovery stories were equally easy to stage. Although stories are constructed by storytellers, and so they have flexibility, they must tie into some cultural anchor or share some past to resonate. This is to say that certain emotion work is easier for some groups than others because of their access to certain types of histories, understandings of themselves, and narratives. In other words, groups' histories and cultures help to shape their capacity for this emotion work. Beyond having the necessary content, the groups needed enough emotional energy to stage the story to spring fully back and recover emotionally. From some emotional low points, there was not enough emotional energy for a direct recovery, which often, and because the red petals marked those emotional low points, that is why it was very difficult for them to spring directly to from grief to joy for stop, or from rage to terror, which they wouldn't want to do for the Catholic workers. Now, beyond having the necessary content, the group like I said, they needed enough emotional energy. Transmuting and leaning into an emotion the groups were more skilled at managing cost less emotional energy. Thus, it made sense as a first step. I must note that effective transmutation from the dangerous emotion to the draining emotion they could manage, it was a difficult thing. It required skill, timing, and at least some personal reserves of emotional energy. And you'll see, I think that is why some people emerged as emotional leaders, because they had those reserves of emotional energy that they could invest. So thus, even though this kind of emotion work could be highly effective, it was analogous to playing with emotional fire, because one could imagine how things could go wrong if you are in rage and you add grief to that as an attempt to recover. It usually worked, but if it didn't, it would spell disaster. Now, there's another theory that I've been working with that also provides some helpful tools for thinking about springing from draining emotion to motivating emotion. And it's opponent-process dynamics. Opponent-process theory states that if one experiences a negative stimulus, there is an initial peak level of distress in response to the threat. And that's where you would get A, where you have the negative stimulus and there is no compensating response yet. So it's the lowest level experience. This initial peak then mellows out over time as long as the negative stimulus is constant. It has to remain constant for this to work. The mellowing out in response to the threat is due to counter processes that work to stabilize experience. And those build up more slowly than the negative stimulus, but they also last longer than a negative stimulus. So another way of saying this is that if threat is applied long enough, the state becomes a new normal. So you could see B, that when you have the negative stimulus and you have a compensating positive response, you end up with neutral affect. Now, if the negative stimulus is then removed after the new normal has been established, there's a sudden drop in threat and a boost in positive experience. That's where you get C. So immediately after the taking away the negative stimulus, but the compensating positive response has not trailed off yet, you get a peak snapping into a positive experience. Now, snapping into a positive experience happens when the counter process that's been stabilizing does not end as abruptly as the threatening stimulus. This creates a temporary euphoric experience. So it's like releasing a rubber band in tension. If it's released suddenly, the rubber band does not return to where it started, right? Instead, the rubber band moves beyond the original position before it returns to its slack state. So opponent process theory helps to account for how purposefully applying a negative emotion can lead to positive emotions, right? That counterintuitive move. The result is that you actually feel better and more energized than before you had the negative experience. Eventually, everything returns to baseline rather quickly. But there are moments that are positive and exhilarating. And those moments can create, and I did for these groups, a sense of that history is on one side or even God is on one side. I would suggest that if you look closely at the day-to-day emotional dynamics of all sorts of groups who routinely face failure, we might see a succession of opposite emotions, as emotional vacuums are leaned into, then released, only to be leaned into again in the future as more emotion management is required. Thus, these recovery strategies might help to minimize the burnout we often see in helping professions. So finally, on to the part that I've been told that you might find the most interesting, which is the methods part. I know it's traditional, like I said, to begin with methods, but here I am ending with methods. Now, I suggest that emerging research in brain science suggests that we should be thinking about two types of thinking and emotion. The literature that I refer to refers to these as type 1 and type 2 processes. There has been a flood of interest in dual processes in sociology, especially culture and cognition work. And this is what they're referring to with the dual processes, the type 1 and the type 2. Now, type 1 processes take a very long time to learn. They're deployed automatically, and they are not readily available for discursive deliberation or communication. These processes happen outside of awareness. And type 2 processes are learned through conscious, quick, episodic memories. This way of thinking is deployed deliberately and is readily available for discursive deliberation and communication. Now, as I said, these processes are conscious. It's generally recognized that most of sociology has focused on type 2 processes. Interviewing, indeed, highlights this sort of process because you were relying on what people can tell us. And type 1 processes have received far less attention, but are, for those of us who are interested in emotion, very important for understanding emotions. Now, I think ethnographers are well positioned to uncover type 1 processes. What you've just heard, these stories I've told you, are about type 1 dynamics. These groups were not able to explain to me why they worked in the way that they worked. I had to stay around for a long time before I was able to explain it. They certainly could not. I suggest that findings about mirror neurons and the fact that ethnography allows us to tap into mirror neurons means that ethnography is ripe for shedding light on understudied type 1 processes. So very briefly, what are mirror neurons? Now, mirror neurons are neurons that fire the same way when I see or anticipate another performing an action or experiencing a feeling, and they act in the same way as they do when I perform or feel the same myself. This is to say there are parts of the parietal lobe and the premotor region that respond similarly to watching and performing the same action. So parts of my brain respond the same way whether you or I are picking up a spoon. These findings, there more recent research suggests that much of emotion is communicated through mirror neurons, suggesting we have a direct neural capacity for empathy with other actors. So what do mirror neurons mean for ethnographers? The ethnographer inserts themselves into a scene until they have confirmation that they are seeing the world much as an insider would. Subjects often tell ethnographers when they have achieved that understanding. For me, I was in a Catholic worker house, and since they give away everything they have as soon as they have it, they very rarely have any sort of steady type of resources for any resource that you might need. So someone came to dinner and asked for a napkin, and I leaned over and said, well, how about a tissue? And I handed them a tissue instead. And one of the Catholic workers hit the table and said, that was a very Catholic worker thing to do. And little did they know I probably would have done the same in my own house. But what I learned from them is that they saw in me, they were beginning to resonate with me, and they were sort of giving me some signals that I had at least come a fairly far ways in. It took me almost a year to get to that point, though. So interacting in the scene, means that you're tapping into mirror neurons. And so there's potentially the capacity to detect and analyze type 1 dynamics. So this sounds hopefully interesting and compelling, but there are obviously some complications for these methods. I'll cover 4 of them very briefly. First, we need better methods to be able to assess whether we are accurately reading others' emotions or whether we are projecting our own emotions onto their experiences, right? I'm not aware of any literature that would give us a sort of official help to distinguish between the two. Using more than one ethnographer in a site might be a way to solve this problem. Second, we need to establish processes for shifting from type 1 data collection to type 2 thinking about that we have to do in order to do analysis of those type 1 data, right? So we can't stay type 1 all the way. You can't do subliminal academic work. You need to actually write out theories and formal propositions. So far, our only technique for taking emotion-rich is to take emotion-rich field notes and then reflect back on those notes, which is what you heard me do today. But we will undoubtedly eventually develop more specific and thorough practices for recognizing and analyzing type 1 processes. Third, and maybe the least problematic for ethnographers, is it turns out that the assumption that we have direct, unmediated connections to others' perceptions and emotions is actually not quite accurate. We must connect mirror neurons to other parts of the brain in order for them to be deployed effectively. Here is an example. We see someone walking towards someone with a knife. We need to add context and meaning to our direct sensory information to discern if we are about to see a murder or a surgery. Right? So ethnographers will always have to focus on culture in the way that they've always done. And this focus on culture then would be in addition to relying on mirror neurons for more type 1 processes. And fourth and finally, how do we represent what we have observed and analyzed? How can we convincingly communicate our type 1 findings? I suggest that evoking similar emotions in the reader might be the most effective and direct way to communicate these findings. The stories I included in the talk, these detailed stories that were structured more like fiction, those were my best effort to capture and communicate the findings about the type 1 processes that I felt and observed. Thus, I think that this is very important. That's what might seem like a divergence from science. Elaborate stories could actually bring us closer to more accurate and general understanding of type 1 processes in the real world. So the notion that elaborate stories would be from a position that would be counter sort of a formal science position in social science. I don't think there has to be that distinction. I think that these elaborate stories may indeed be more scientific than other approaches might be. So with that final point, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very clear and very provocative at the same time. Okay, now we are going to open for questions, 4 questions or 3, and then she answers, and then we go back so we can build the discussion. Don't feel afraid. We all have bad English. Don't worry for that. Adriana. El micrófono.
Thank you very much for your talk.
It's not working, as usual. Even though I called this morning for that.
Thank you for your talk. It's very interesting. I've been reading your work so not all of it, but some of your work. And I have two questions. One is about something you mentioned here, that this work could be useful to understand and manage cases where there are emotional drains, and you mentioned teaching and nursing. And for me, it was a bit difficult to imagine teaching, because I know sometimes in teaching you have this emotional drain. I think students also have this emotional drain, but it was difficult for me to apply what you said to that case, because in the case of social movements, there's a cause, there's an emotional cause, and when that is not working out, then something happens. So for teaching, I couldn't imagine how you would apply it. So if you could elaborate on that. And the second question is, I read the article you published with Van Ness about the cube of involvement, which is very interesting. It has a lot of insightful things, but I was thinking how to make that to operationalize, how would you say, to make it empirical, to use it for empirical observation, and I couldn't imagine how. And I wonder if you have some empirical work on that, if you could share that with us. Thank you.
Si se van presentando, por favor. Sí, I forgot it.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I am Armando Garduño, a PhD student here in politics science, oriented towards communication. I am studying politics, emotion in campaigns, in TV campaigns, and I am more or less following that distinction between type 1 and type 2 systems. It is called here System A or System B, different denominations, but one that is more specific is disposition system and surveillance system. That means disposition system, that type 1 or System A, it relies on habits and acquired behaviors and practices toward known stimuli. And the surveillance systems, on the other hand, reacts with conscious attention. George Marcus, who is the one that proposes that theory, affective intelligence theory, he argues that System A or System 1 has enthusiasm as a primary emotion, because we can have confidence in our proven behavior. And on the other hand, the surveillance system, or System 2, relies on anxiety that is brought up because of the new stimuli that we confront. In that way, how does this dual system account relates with discrete models of emotion, like you are using one, like many emotions, many distinct emotions? And if we indeed have two systems, which could be the emotions that belongs to System A and System 2 or System B?
Thank you, Fernando. Let her answer these two questions, because I think they're big enough, and then we are going to continue.
I think that that's a really interesting question about, so if we look at things in terms of type 1, type 2, or A and B, how do individual specific emotions map onto that? I would say that emotions are relational, and you can see in this case how the same specific emotion can be A or B or 1 or 2, depending on the relations, right? So that anger is courted in one and avoided as much as possible in the other. So I would think that this is an orientation then that we could bring to the study of distinct emotions, assuming that that's a problem that's going to be a local problem, right? So what are how do the distinct emotions work in this setting? And then use the tools of type 1 and type 2 to try to figure that out. So that's how I see the connection, because I guess so in a short, to put it like very briefly, I don't think they map very well into each other, because I think that it's based on relation, not the specific emotion. Okay. The cube of involvement, empirical implications for the cube of involvement. I have to tell you that was like a dragon whose tail we were trying to catch. You know, we're barely hanging on to the concepts, and we're so grateful when we formalized them enough that we were able to write it down. So the idea is that there's let me see if the temporal orientation, which is it our interactions, our involvements more mere neuron based, so that they're immediate temporal, or are they longer term and less mere neuron based and more based on cognition we've learned. The other dimension is on like a power and solidarity. Do they fall more towards power or more towards solidarity? And then the other dimension is, now I can't even remember what my third dimension was. Do you remember? We have temporal, and we had power, and, excuse me?
The length of the group, or the dimension of the length of the group.
Oh, yes, right. Whether how focused the interaction was. Right, absolutely. Thank you. So I say this just so that I can give some answer, and that for people who aren't familiar with it, understand what we were trying to do, which is to take each of these dimensions and imagine then how different involvements would fall along these continua as like a strategy for keeping track of different types of involvements. Empirically, if you could come up with a way to formalize this so we could test it, we'd be happy to include a new co-author. Right. But it's a very good question. And teaching, I think it's interesting, because the way that I saw some of the work that I was doing here was moving from Hochschild, who talked about sort of individual level emotion work, and then taking it to a group level. And the individual and the group don't map very neatly onto each other. In terms of the group, there was much less of a backstage where these things could happen. They had to work these emotions out with each other. So I suppose there was a backstage in that, like, not all outsiders were included in this deep emotion work, but definitely if they retreated to manage these emotions as individuals, the groups would have, I can say quite confidently, would have fallen apart. So I think that the way to understand for teaching would actually be the opposite move from what I did from Hochschild to trying to understand groups, which is, I think, take what I talked about at groups and try to then imagine on the individual level. My mother was an elementary school teacher, and she often talked about that it was a profession where you had unending social stimulus, but it was one of the loneliest professions at the same time. Right. So I do think I think what she was getting at is a lot of that work is work that you have to do on the individual level. So that would be my answer for that.
Thank you. Someone else? Erika.
So, well, thank you so much for your talk. I am Eric Serna from El Colegio de México, PhD student of the El Colegio de México. Well, I'm going to do my best effort to express my ideas in English. Following the idea of Adriana, where is the management of the emotions, all this emotional work all this kind of learning or to manage the emotion. I think in your work, I don't see this all this kind of experience, and you are learning in the management of the emotions. For instance, in the management of the hate, how can you transform this negative emotion in a positive one? I think I noticed this vacuum in your work, and I want to know what do you think about that.
So, like, what is the mechanism that would get one from one side of the emotional vacuum to the other side?
Yes, actually.
Yes, right.
How can this process to learning to transform this?
Oh, and also so what's the mechanism and how would one learn the mechanism?
Yes.
I would say that for social movement groups, the learning part, I would say, is usually baptism by fire. The groups that don't figure this out fall apart, and I think more often than not, they fall apart. So I think in some ways I'm studying something that's rare. So I'm not sure that it can be used for all social movement groups, mostly for those that, like I said, can endure beyond disturbances in their environment, and that this emotional process allows them to be somewhat separate from that, so they can sustain that. So as a group, I think they learn it through sheer necessity. How are we going to figure out how to stay together? In terms of what is the mechanism, that's what I was trying to get at with using Randall Collins and using opponent process theory, but I think that I am also dissatisfied with, I feel like, in discussions of causality, you can get closer and closer, but you feel like you can never really get there because you really can't make the strong causal argument. I feel like using Randall Collins's work in opponent process theory is like narrowing in on what happens, but to claim that is literally the mechanism that gets from one to the other, I'm a bit unsatisfied with it too. Mostly what I'm unsatisfied with, what does it mean to release the tension? What does it mean? How I see the tension there, I see the consequences of it having been released. What does it mean to release the tension? And I can see that it's the reorienting of attention, right? That they move attention from one thing to another. Mm-hmm. And I'm inclined to say that happens because someone is able to tell a story that's more compelling than the emotions that are going on at that moment. Mm-hmm. And that shift then allows for the release. Mm-hmm. So I do know at the heart of it, it's focus of attention and how it changes. But I wish I knew more too about the focus of attention and literally what's happening in those sort of micro moments. And I do think it's somebody being able to invest emotional energy to tell a more compelling story.
Okay. Very interesting. Por favor, aquí en el centro, Erika. Marina.
Hi, I am Daniela, and I have from El Colegio de México.
Okay.
And I have two questions for you.
Sociology or what?
I'm doing a master's in gender studies, but I study sociology.
Okay.
So I wanted to know, why did you decide to work with two groups as a comparative ethnography and not just choose one group? And the other question is, what was the role of emotional leaders in the groups you studied, and how were they related to group hierarchies?
The comparative aspect was because I was trained by a theorist, and so theorists are always looking for comparisons so they can make more abstract claims. So, and
happens to be Randall Collins.
Yes, that happens to be Randall Collins. But to tell you the truth, I think I could have come up, it would have been a very different story. I would have had different theory, but if I'd selected one case, at least the way that I approach ethnography and I train ethnographers is that what you're trying to move towards is the interesting comparison within the group anyways. So it ends up being a comparative analysis, even if it's only one site. So so that's the comparative part. Emotional leaders, very interesting, and the Catholic workers, because there were clear emotional leaders and there weren't supposed to be any leaders at all. It was supposed to be entirely, equal, and but that really wasn't the case. Which meant that the emotional leader could sometimes become somewhat manipulative because there was no way to hold them accountable without saying, you're not being totally equal. And in that group to say, if you're not going by consensus and treating everybody the same, was one of the worst things you could accuse somebody of. So it meant that emotional leader could actually be somewhat emotionally manipulative. The other group is interesting in that sometimes the emotional leaders were not the official leader of the paid top dog of the group. So that presented very different emotional dynamics from the consensus-based group. And what I saw was that most of the emotional leaders were women, and this is interesting you asked this since you study gender, but the formal leaders were all men. And so what happened was there was a two-step sort of process to their emotional labor. They did this emotion management, and then they buoyed the leader almost immediately afterwards so that they didn't feel threatened by the fact that they had so much emotional power in the group. And to their great shame, the leaders, they would just lap it up. They would just like, oh yes, thank you. I am this really great leader. So, I mean, and if you think about, emotional labor going unpaid, unnoticed, unappreciated, that's true. But then if you add on that too, on top of it, that you have to hide the fact that you're the one with the power, that makes it particularly interesting, I think.
Well, while you think, I have a question. Or an observation. It impresses me that you studied groups that failed, because what people do usually is to study groups that are successful. So can you elaborate on what did you get from that, as opposed to studying successful groups? I mean, I think it was very insightful to see these microdynamics, that like survival strategies, because if you stay all time in sadness or in what was the other one? The other group, anger, then you cannot act. So it's like a unconscious strategy to survive in an environment. And that's one. And the second, I'm sorry, is whether in these two groups, attending to the question of Eric, did you find ritualistic actions? Because that's where we grasp the dynamic of the group. What are these patterns of interactions that could be rituals? Okay.
I'll do the second one first, which is the rituals. They were informal rituals, which made learning them very difficult, going back to your question of how they learned. So that what I found was that the rituals were most intense in the Catholic workers, and I think it's because the emotional strain that they faced was more intense. And the way I envisioned it was that it was a group that was very hard to get into, because if you couldn't figure out those rituals, you just bounced right off the group. There's so many people who came that wanted to be Catholic workers and be part of this community, and they could not figure out what was going on an interaction level, and they just bounced right off the group. But once you got in, it was actually hard to leave, because these emotional rituals were so incredibly intense that they were sort of like they become emotional junkies. And then the rituals at the anti-death penalty group, like I said, because they were trying to sort of hide this emotion work from the leader, those were also implicit. And but rather than bouncing off, they were willing to do much more training of the newcomers so that they would fit in, which is why she would take the time and actually go to Sadness, a place she didn't like to go, in order to teach me not to do that, right? The Catholic workers would not have done that work. They would have just left you out of the conversation, looked at you strangely, whatever, and you would have gotten the message that you weren't fitting in, and off you'd go. So yes, the rituals were incredibly important, and in both groups for different reasons, were sort of hidden in terms of the expectations for how to be a good ritual participant. In terms of picking failing groups, one of them was because, like I said, I wanted to see social dynamics that I figured would be more intense and more frequent in groups that failed. And so it would allow me to, within 2 years, to be able to see more emotional volatility than I would have in a more stable group. I also, personally, I think that there are two really important questions in sociology, which is how do things change and how do they stay the same? And studying groups that fail sort of allows you to look at both of those things at the same time. Although I recently had a discussion with somebody else who, I can't remember what they said, that no, you have the wrong two questions. The question is, how do people work together, and when did they fail, and when does it fall apart? Which I was like, that sort of fits with mine. But anyway, everybody has their own, these are the important sociological questions, but those are mine. How do things change and how do they stay the same?
Okay. Vania, ya te vi la cara. Present yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Vania. I'm a sociology student. Like going back to the question about working with this Catholic association, did you find yourself? I mean, of course you did. I mean, in any situation where you, as an ethnographer, like felt difficult, like the field work in terms of your own emotions as a research. I mean, you say there's like a lot of like a really intense ritual of like belonging to this organization. So I would like to know about your experience.
Well, quite honestly, this is probably the most efficient way I can put it. They give away everything they have. And so eventually my husband said, I think we better put the house in my name. Yeah, I mean, there are moments, and I think I personally think that good ethnography is sort of going native and coming back and going native and coming back and going native and coming back. I mean, people talk about going native like it's a terrible thing, but I'm not sure how you get at some of those emotional and type 1 processes unless you do. And what I didn't talk about in the story is much of their day-to-day work was with children, and to work, to spend so much time with children who had nothing was incredibly draining. It took me a long time to be able to write about them too, because I became emotionally connected enough to the group that I needed to spend like 2 years away from them. And then returned to my notes and was able to see them through a new lens. I'm not sure if you can study emotions in this way without subjecting yourself to that sort of thing. But I can tell you now that my second project is on fishing and whale watching as a form of recovery. I will go back to poverty and injustice, but I needed a break first because it is emotionally hard.
Fernando.
Thank you. I have another question, please, about expectations, which you just mentioned. In your opinion, which is the role of expectations in the creating of emotions? To be more precise, the satisfaction of expectations or the frustration of expectations. How does that work in the creating of emotions? Yeah.
I would say that The expectations at STOP, the anti-death penalty group, were almost never met, and they were repeatedly frustrated, and people cycled through that organization relatively quickly, I think because of the tension between what they expected and what they actually got. They expected to be able to feel powerful in the face of capital punishment, but they soon realized that unless you could either change the law directly or save individual people, that wasn't emotionally realistic. I think that the reason why the Catholic workers had such durability was because they shifted their expectations so that it was, their only expectation was that we stay here and we subject ourselves to this and we survive. And since those were their expectations, I think that's why they could find that joy and that humor, because they had pretty much let go of all sort of practical expectations.
Thank you.
¿Alguien más? Well, I have another one. We were talking before coming here about the relevance of cognitive sciences for sociology and for sociology of emotions. And that's a point of conflict in our group, because some people think whether it is important, we are not trained for that. So why take in account of that? So since you have been going through that branch, I would like you to elaborate a little bit of.
Sure. Yeah, sure. I mean, and I think in some ways it doesn't feel as foreign to me as it might to other people, because I started out in psychology where you were expected to know this and switched to sociology. So I never felt like it was something that I wasn't, that I didn't have the capacity to at least learn more on my own about, that I had already had sort of a formal education in it. So that was part of it. Also, my own work, my own questions took me back to it repeatedly, just following sort of curiosity and analysis. And what I saw was that brain scientists are doing social science, but they're doing it quite frequently very poorly. They don't realize, from what I can tell, a lot of them, that there are already fields where people are doing this work and doing it very well. But we can come from the other direction and know their importance and make them understand ours. So why would we bother doing that? And I think it's because, I think if you were to compare sort of the grant money going into brain science compared to all the social scientists combined, I think that brain science would probably win. I think it is the future, whether we want it to be or not. And if we continue to do work and build theory that can't at least speak to it or take it into account, we risk building a house of cards that may fall down, that we could have prevented just with sort of a basic understanding of brain science. What I just said is very controversial, even amongst my closest colleagues. They don't agree with me necessarily. So I don't necessarily expect many people here to agree with me either. But that is my take on it.
Thank you very much. Okay. Silvia.
Silvia Gutierrez from Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana. When I saw the chart where you have the positive and negative emotions, I was thinking that if there could be another way of classifying emotions that are not positive or negative or black or white, or whether it'll be better to talk about emotions that have a positive or negative charge in certain contexts,
Right.
rather than just labeling as positive or negative. I was thinking, especially in social movements like anger or like anger and indignation,
Mm-hmm.
that are classified as negative, can have a positive effect, no? When they move them to do something. You need to be angry to get together and then do something for for what you're looking at, for what you're fighting for. So could there be another way of classifying them? Or you were talking about elasticity, or you know, and that really makes me wonder whether if it is really correct to classify them as they've been classified.
Well, that's why I tried to, and it may have been too subtle, but that's why I tried to talk about them instead of negative and positive as draining and motivating, because I needed to do that because anger did play a totally different role in the two groups. So I couldn't call it negative when one of the groups counted on it for their day-to-day survival emotionally. So I think you're quite right. So, you know, I think that then the work has to talk about the dynamics between motivating and draining emotions and not be, as you pointed out, tied to the specific emotions, and, you know, understand that the meaning of the specific emotions will change based on the relational context. I absolutely, totally agree with you.
We have to change our vocabulary.
We do have to change our vocabulary. And there's other work that I've come across recently that might also help to prevent sort of the negative positive. I'm not sure if anybody's familiar with Michael Apter's reversal theory of emotion. No? I'm trying to work with it, and I'm not sure if it holds water. The more I work with it, the more it seems to slip through my fingers. But that's the reason why I went towards it, because I think you're right. We need a more nuanced theoretical approach that doesn't rely on simple designations like that.
Bueno, ¿hay alguna otra pregunta o inquietud? Están muy seriecitos hoy. Bueno, entonces, si no es así, vamos a cerrar con esta sesión. Bueno, no las actividades porque tenemos otra mañana, pero sí, por lo menos estamos conmemorando. We are celebrating with your conference our 10 years of meeting. So thank you very much. And we have las constancias, no, for each of you, of the ones that assisted to the seminar the whole year, and the other people who want their certificate. We will give them to you later on, after we, no, Vania? Like a week later, no? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. It was very interesting.